welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. I'm really excited about today's episode, and I hope you'll follow along with me here. I actually am going to be putting this into two distinct episodes. Today, we're going to be doing God Needs Therapy, and next Sunday, we'll be doing God Makes for a Bad Therapist. So in that one, we'll be looking at God's advice on mental health, if you can call it that he gives in the Bible. And today, we're going to be looking at, once again, God's character. And to highlight that character or contrast it, we're going to be bumping it up against modern mental health. Surely, the God of the universe who created our brains, our neurochemistry, the arbiter of right and wrong, will not be too far distanced from what we have found to be emotionally healthy. Now, before all the excuses roll in, I want to point you to one of three videos because I know you're going to be tempted to say one of the following things. Who are you to judge God? You can look at this video right here. Oh, you're just cherry picking verses. See this video. Or, well, you don't understand Brandon. His ways are higher. He's not a human. He's not going to be subject to these human things. See this video right here. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive right in. What is the goal of today's video? I'm going to share 20 different concepts of mental health with you. And for each of those, I'm going to just keep it short and give one verse that shows God doing the exact opposite. Now, to go ahead and just answer the cherry picking part of it, yes, there are also verses that show sometimes God doing some of these things. But if we have a God who is not consistent or who is this contradictory in nature, very man-made-esque, I would say, I think it's enough to prove the point that I'm trying to get across here. Okay, enough explaining. Let's dive in here. I'm a big proponent of mental health, of counseling, of therapy. I don't think you have to have a problem to do it. I think that it's a great preemptive resource. I think all of us have so much childhood trauma or issues that have happened in our life that we need to work through in a professional setting. I think it is good, and good. I'm not an expert. I don't know everything, but I have compiled these 20 concepts within the mental health community that I think are pretty obvious and fair. There shouldn't be anything that stands out too starkly here. The first one is going to be emotional regulation. So what does all the God of creation have to say for us? How about Exodus 32:10? Now therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them. This God can't deal with the people around him. He needs his alone time just to what? Sulk in his anger, in his petty jealousy, and take that time to plan and then act out and destroy entirely these people who have offended him? Now, I know he's a God in this context, and we are just people. As we go through these, I'd encourage you to think, would you make any excuse for any person, no matter how good or just or nice or forgiving they are, if when they were offended, this is how they emotionally regulated themselves? And again, think about that as we go through the rest of these examples. Let's keep going. How about conflict resolution? That's something we can agree is probably a healthy tool in the tool belt for mental health. Well, in Revelation 20:15, we get this. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. The creator of everything, who's at fault, by the way, for sin in the world, the best way he could resolve this conflict of his entire creation being fallen and given a sinful nature was not only to mysteriously hide himself away and have this book written over millennia with all of these anonymous authors giving vague and contradictory descriptions about what to do to be saved, but it was straight up to punish eternally, forever, the vast majority of everyone he ever made. That's his resolution to the initial conflict, whether the initial conflict you consider to be Satan's fall or Adam and Eve's sin. Either way, it started with 1 to 3 creatures and somehow has affected hundreds of billions of people. This got out of control, and a real God, a real good God, a real graceful God could have and should have done better. How about trust? Do we think this God has any trust issues? It's important not to just give it away, right? If you were in counseling, you might hear something like, you do need to learn to open up and to trust again, though there needs to be some healthy boundaries around that, and we'll get into boundaries as well. So what's a good example of how God trusts? Let me read this to you from Job. Job 2:3, and the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? That there is none like him on this earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. Now, I love this verse because we get God's clear explanation in Job that Job didn't deserve it. It was unjust from the mouth of God. But he has one person, supposedly, on this entire earth who is upright, who does fear him the way he wants to be feared, as if that's some bragging right. And instead of enjoying that relationship relationship that was supposed to be the ideal, right? What does he do? He blows it up. It's self-sabotage. He works with Job's mortal enemy, with God's mortal enemy, to torture this man and to murder most of the people in his life. God has trust issues. Communication skills, though, that's important. Maybe God could have done better with these first three if he could just communicate with us clearly. Well, that could be a problem because in Isaiah 45:15 we hear, "Truly you are a God who hides himself, O God of Israel." And of course we could jump 10 chapters forward and do the whole "my thoughts are not your thoughts." Well, then why did you make us in your image? We're like you. We look like you. We have a mind like you, supposedly. But you set yourself so far apart as to be too mysterious to communicate with or understand properly, left open to way too much interpretation. On the opposite end of the spectrum, God claims he's not the author of confusion, and yet look at all the confusion. And every Christian who's about to comment that they're clear and they know, just read the other comments. You can't all be right, which means most of you, if not all of you, are wrong, which means this God sucks at communicating. Let's move into those healthy boundaries. Now, boundaries are tricky, but they're really important. And the priority of a boundary is actually to protect a relationship. I think a lot of people utilize boundaries as an excuse to cut someone out of their life. A boundary is, hey, I want to be in communion with you. I want relationship, but we both need to make sure that we're agreeing on some things and we don't cross each other's lines here. If you don't have the boundary, the relationship explodes. If you have the boundary purposefully, ideally it is to create that intimacy and or at least preserve the relationship. So let's look in 1 Samuel 15:3. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. There's two things here. One, this is an entire lack of a boundary. God doesn't even have a boundary on himself. He was wronged. Kill them all. And even if in his justice, and let's go ahead and hop on board that it would be ever just to collectively punish an entire group of people, let's say every last man was wicked, and God, being the general of his army of the Israelites, needed to wipe them out, and somehow that genocide was going to be okay. If I grant you that, could there not have been a boundary to prevent the innocent women who were just at home, the children who were just out playing, the infants who have done and thought and known nothing, or even the animals? This is entirely lacking in any boundary whatsoever. This is the opposite of trying to keep relationship. This is severing relationship to the highest degree. Yeah, but Brandon, who cares? Amalek and his group were obviously the Gentiles. They're not his chosen people. You don't see a problem with that? By the way, there's plenty of God killing his own chosen people, including women and children. But chances are, if you're watching this, you're not a chosen person. Should God get free reign to kill you just because you're a collective member of the non-group? It's insanity. And we wouldn't accept these boundaries or lack thereof from anyone else ever in any capacity. How about adaptability? Now, you don't want to be shifting all over the place and going with the flow and just mirroring everyone around you and having no sense of self, but you should be somewhat adaptable to new experiences, new thoughts, etc. How does God do? Malachi 3:6, "For I, the Lord, do not change." And it's meant to be this comforting thing of God's immutability. But when you see who this God was at the time that he said this, all you'd want this God to do is change. Stop being okay with slavery. Stop having little girls raped. Stop murdering everyone and everything who gets in your way. So if you are watching this in the modern age and you think that your religion is all butterflies and rainbows with kind, humble Jesus sitting on your shoulder helping you live your life, you forget God's very direct claim from his mouth, not some apologist, not some messed up translation out of context of the Bible. This is God saying he doesn't change. So how he felt about something once is how he feels about it now. He hates foreigners. He hates homosexuals. He despises women. Pretty much, if you are not a straight Israelite man, this God, at the time of saying this in Malachi, does not like you, care for you, or have a plan for you. What about mindfulness? Many of the ancient religions and philosophies all understood the importance of a meditation or mindfulness practice, being present, being in the moment, not being anxious, being confident in who you are. There's many different paths that mindfulness can look and what one hopes to achieve from it, but it's some of of these things, but let's see what it is for God. Numbers is never good. Numbers 14:11 through 12. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will this people despise me? And how long will they not believe in me in spite of all the signs that I have done among them? I will strike them with the pestilence and disinherit them. This whiny, vindictive, vengeful bully that is describing himself here is the opposite of someone who is at peace with themselves, knows their value, experiences what's going on around them in a calm and centered state, and then acts appropriately. But Moses, don't you see what I've done? Why did I waste time with all these miracles if they're still going to sin and not believe in me? I know, I'll kill them. I'll disinherit them. Solid mental health there, Yahweh. But what about gratitude? Surely this God understands gratitude. Well, Isaiah 1:11 says, what to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord. I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of well-fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of goats. Well, there's, I think, 27, no, it's in the 40s, 42 or 47 times in the Bible where God talks about how much he loves the smell of burnt offerings. The reason that people were even doing this in the first place is because God commanded it. It was the only way to atone for their sins. Remember, something always has to die. Something has to bleed. Life has to be extinguished. That's how you make this God happy. Even in your pretty New Testament, this just became Jesus. God set all that up, by the way. That's not like some requirement that existed in the ether and God came into a place and adopted that. That's God's design for reconciliation. And here, when he's getting boatloads of it, of people before they enter his holy place, he says, I'm tired of this. This doesn't do it for me anymore. Not only is this against his own word, but it is very ungrateful. They are just trying to follow your direction. They are just trying to please you. This might be a good time, considering how I just spoke, to explain that oftentimes in these videos, I am talking in hypotheticals. I don't mean to sound so sarcastic right now. I just can't tell you that I get like 5 comments per video at least, if not in the emails, that are like, well, you talk about this God like you believe in him. I'm talking about the God in the context that the Bible talks about this God, which is to portray him as a realistic character. I do not believe in this God. This is all within the framework of if this God were true, and not to judge this God, but to say this God obviously is not true. Look how man-made this is. Caveat out of the way. Let us continue. How about positive affirmations? Now, this might feel a little hokum or hoo-hoo to some of you, but it is important to have positive self-talk and maybe have a couple things that you remind yourself of. What does God say out loud about himself? Well, let's go back to Isaiah 45:7. I form the light and create darkness. I make well-being and create evil. I am the Lord who does all these things. Again, I'm not just trying to smuggle in the verse where God talks about creating evil. This is God's address of himself. Here's who I am. I make the good and the bad, the light and the dark, the benefit and the evil. I am all of these things. You might want to tweak those positive affirmations a little bit and or the actual truth of them. Imagine showing up to therapy, explaining to your counselor your new mantra or positive affirmation you've been working on. I give birth to the kids, I kill the kids. There's something wrong with that second part, right? Should the therapist stop and congratulate us on the fact we made kids in the first place? Or is it more important that after the good thing, there's something else that needs attending to? Just saying. What about vulnerability? Brandon, I got you here. There's lots of examples of God or Jesus being vulnerable. Actually, I racked my mind as much as I could, and then I did some searches to see, do we ever get a humble, vulnerable moment with God? And that's definitely open to interpretation. God does show sadness, and if that were all it took for vulnerable, you could give it to him. There was one verse in Hosea, I think, that I would have counted for God being vulnerable. And then we also have Jesus showing vulnerability probably 2 times, I would say, in the New Testament. One is when he is praying in the garden and he's begging God to find another way, which that verse is so problematic for so many reasons. It just has so many issues. Aside from that, the other one is when Jesus wept, shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus is humanly affected by the loss of someone he cared for. So again, I'm never saying that God or Jesus don't do any of these things. I'm just saying they also often do the exact opposite. So when you're sitting there thinking about humble little Jesus, kneeling, praying, begging for God to do something different, and crying because his friend died, I want you to think of this Jesus also. And this Jesus comes to us from Revelation 19:15. Coming out of his mouth is a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. He will rule them with an iron scepter. That is not a very vulnerable Jesus. That is a conquering warlord. I think it's so funny that most apologetics on Jesus are pointing to his time on earth as a man while ignoring that he claims to be there from the beginning with God, as God, and the role that he will play in the end times. We have a literal eternity of Jesus and his character, and most Christians and apologists want to focus on the 33 years he was on earth in human form. This is the real Jesus, and he sure looks a lot like Yahweh. So yeah, I think not as vulnerable as one might think. When one is on the journey to good mental health, it's important to come up with good coping mechanisms. There are bad coping mechanisms. A coping mechanism in and of itself is not necessarily a beneficial tool, but there are good ones. What are you going to do when you get that initial bout of anxiety, when you start to feel stressed, when you start to feel depressed, etc.? How are you going to cope and cope well? Well, how about do 29, 27 through 28? Therefore, the anger of the Lord was kindled against this land, bringing upon it all the curses written in this book. And the Lord uprooted them from their land in anger and fury and great wrath, and cast them into another land as they are to this day. Oh, that's not good coping. That's one of those bad copes. And it also seems to be God's go-to. Get butthurt, get offended, be displeased with the weak, horrible, sinful nature of the creation from the dirt that you made, who are acting just in the way that you allowed them and created them to act. Still get pissed off, though, and offended, even though you are a perfect God, which would mean you require nothing, including the obedience or worship of people, and then smite them and call it just wrath. My young children have already learned to cope better than this with disappointment or offense or insecurity or any of the other things that this God is reacting out of. This is not the creator of all things. For all of you who would initially say, you can't judge God like a human, he's the one that created it all, sure, that would be fine if we didn't have an enormous amount of examples proving just how weak and human he is, and even the least of these. But we all mess up, so how about a little empathy? How about a little bit of compassion? Well, don't ask God for it, because here's what you're going to get. Psalm 103, 13 through 14. As a father shows compassion to his children. Oh, wait. This might be good. Fathers have the availability to be extremely compassionate with children. Is this going to set up an analogy for God as a good father? So the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him, for he knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust. This is why in secular Bible study, I've been saying over and over, how are we calling this God a good father? He's not slow to anger. He doesn't communicate with us. He doesn't cope well when we act out or act our immaturity compared to him, and all of the other things we've already covered so far. But when it comes to empathy or compassion, how does he define it? Yeah, I'll show compassion to those who fear me, and don't think for a second I haven't forgotten your framework that you're from the dust. Okay. Got it, God. And yeah, the Bible says some other pretty things about God's grace and forgiveness, not as pretty as you would think. It's conditional forgiveness. He only forgives us under certain circumstances. Healthy forgiveness is not conditional. Now, what about resilience? This is something that could kind of go both ways, but resilience should be a good character trait. It's important to be resilient, to not break down, to not give up, to not throw it all away. How does God do that? Genesis 6:6, which by the way, I think we're going to do a standalone episode on soon. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Do you know what happens after that? The flood, where he killed like 99.99999% of everything that was alive on the earth at that time. This is the opposite of resilient. This quite literally is giving up. And it's not the only time that he does it. His next bout of this will be when now his creation is actually getting along with itself too well. They're able to communicate perfectly because it's one language, which by the way, would have been the perfect time to start writing your Bible so everyone could understand it. No context issues, no translations. What did God do instead? He confused everybody on purpose. Remember, he's not an author of confusion. He confused everybody on purpose. He spread them out all over the world, changed their languages, and made it impossible for us to have what most Christians tell me is the reason I can't know the Bible, because I don't speak the original 3 languages. How about it's just one language and God never made all these other languages? Again, he didn't. This is a myth about how language originated by people who had no idea. Okay, cutting in. Sorry, I just got interrupted for like 20 minutes and I have no idea where we were. I know we had covered the flood and God's lack of resilience, and I believe we started getting into forgiveness, which is its own point. And here's the verse I had picked out for forgiveness, which I don't think we covered yet. It comes from this week's secular Bible study series, which is Lamentations 3:42 through 44. We have transgressed and rebelled, and you have not forgiven. You have wrapped yourself with anger and pursued us, killing without pity. You have wrapped yourself with a cloud so that no prayer can pass through. So again, not a God of forgiveness. Sometimes forgiveness, conditional forgiveness, like we just talked about, but sometimes not even that. I can't tell you how many Christians I have conversations with that have no idea these verses exist. What do you mean God always forgives? God is so gracious. God is pure love. Read your Bible. How about assertiveness? This is something a lot of people have to work on when they start going to therapy. I need to be able to speak up. I need to be assertive. Now, you would think that's no problem for God, right? But part of assertiveness is not only having the backbone to speak up, but doing so clearly so that it is fair for whoever you are trying to be assertive with. And Jesus bringing what is supposed to be the most important message of all time could have been a little more assertive here. Because in Matthew 13, 10 through 15, we get this. Then the disciples came and said to him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" And he answered them, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given." Maybe I should say selective assertiveness. I see this verse is highly problematic to the fairness or justice of Jesus and what he came to do. But we'll find out here in just a little bit that it's right on par for Jesus's plan, which was not to save the whole world. It was to save the lost sheep of Israel. But we'll get to that in just a second. What about open-mindedness? Now, it's similar to being adaptable, but it is different. It is specifically about not being close-minded, which can get so many of us in so much trouble and harm ourselves and our communities. So I didn't realize we were going to be getting straight to it, but here is that point from Matthew 15, 22 through 26. A Canaanite woman from the vicinity came to him, crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." So I'll finish the verse, but do you think that this is the verse where Jesus said, "Come, put all your worries on me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light"? That would have been a good response. I would have been pretty open-minded to helping even a Canaanite woman. Is this when we see Jesus be compassionate and loving? Nope, none of the above. Choice D. Here it is. Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, for she keeps crying out after us." He didn't even chastise her or send her away. Apathy, sheer indifference to her concerns. She acknowledged who he was. She had faith. She believed in him and what he could do. She had real suffering in her life. None of that pulled on Jesus's heartstrings at all. Complete ignoring. He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." And the woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. He replied, "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." Holy shit. Now, I've covered this verse in a video before, and I feel like I maybe even had a similar reaction because every time it is so stark compared to this idea we have of Jesus. Now, I'll be fair. He breaks down after 2 more requests, and he says, "Okay, fine, here is that scrap," because that's what she ended up asking for. And he healed her instantly. It was nothing for him. He could have done it all along, and he would have done it immediately if he was who he said he was, or what this book has claimed about him. But here, he does say who he is and who he is here for. And it was not her. It was not for the Gentiles. That's where I covered it. I covered it in my Gentiles Made Them Just to Hate Them video. Check it out. This is the opposite of open-minded. This is just in-group think only. Okay, I think we have 4 left. How about humility? Not one of God's strong suits. And here's how. Job 40, 9 through 14. Of course we're going to do Job. It's his biggest brag of the entire Bible. "Have you an arm like God? And can you thunder with a voice like his? Can you adorn yourself with majesty and dignity? Clothe yourself with glory and splendor? Pour out the overflowings of your anger and look on everyone who is proud and debase him." Come on. Not only is this stupid and braggadocious and the opposite of being humble or in humility, but his first 2 brags are so stupid. "You have an arm like me?" This is how you know it was written by man. "You can't throw as far as me. Your voice isn't as low as mine." This is just pure testosterone. Then he brags about the fact he's able to do these things for himself. Yeah, agreed. Why do you need us then? Why do you require such pitiful worship from such a stupid creature when you can adorn yourself with majesty and dignity and clothe yourself with glory and splendor? And his final brag is that he sees all the evil and out of his anger he'll take care of it. Gross. Good job being the biggest warlord. Good job being the biggest, most petty mob boss. What was that about clothing yourself in dignity? And what I love about this is I'm still going to get a ton of stuff about how I'm taking this out of context and how if I just read the rest of the Bible, yada, yada, yada. This is God speaking for himself. It does not get more clear. Who cares what Paul said? Paul never even met Jesus. Not physically when Jesus was alive. You have to believe in the resurrection and Paul's very special trip on the road to Damascus. And even that is at odds with most of what Jesus said or what the rest of the Bible says. So why would you give preference to what Paul said instead of what God is saying for himself? This is God. But okay, let's do the last 3 before this gets too long. Patience. Patience is something that we should all endeavor to have more of. The funny thing is, there's plenty of brags in the Bible about God being slow to anger, which are in like direct contrast with what we actually see, or even the last verse we just covered. But here's what I have to show God is not patient. A little similar to the Canaanite story. It's actually Jesus here. Matthew 17:14 through 18. And when they came to the crowd, a man came up to him and kneeling before him said, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic, and he suffers terribly. For often he falls into the fire and often into the water, and I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him. Which is interesting because Jesus' disciples are supposed to do greater works than he. But that was at the Great Commission. So maybe Jesus had to die and be raised from the dead before they could do that. No problem, we'll give it to him. And Jesus answered, O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me. And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was healed instantly. Talk about a reluctant giver. Talk about little patience. If you're a superhero, and not only that, you created man and allowed illness and sickness into the world. Then you decide it's a good idea to come down to earth to be one of us, supposedly, even though you're still perfect and have magical powers. And the people that do believe in you, you chastise out of impatience because you hated everyone else. Jesus was super pissed off he couldn't do greater works in his own hometown because no one believed in him enough. He could only do a few meager healings. But here you have people believing and begging for it. How long do I have to put up with you guys? How am I supposed to bear this? Would this count as a sin, by the way? This temper, this impatience, this lack of generosity or loving nature? Two more. Ability to handle disappointment. Now, this is an important skill because the fact of the matter is things will not always go our way. So Jesus is probably a great example of how to handle disappointment. Despite what the last verse just said, let's see if it gets any better. This is from Mark 11:12 through 14. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry, and seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, May no one ever eat fruit from you again. And the disciples heard it. So we all know the story about Jesus cursing the fig tree. And there's great apologetics on it that talk about the importance of not just being what you are, but proving what you are through works. Without the fruit, the tree is dead. What matters is not what kind of tree you are, but the fact that you do indeed bear fruit. And it's a fine little apologetic. It could have been made way better, though. Jesus has some pretty decent parables. If he wanted to get this point across, he could. But what it really sounds like is Jesus was hungry, didn't understand that that tree was out of season, handled the disappointment of that poorly, I guess he was hangry, and cursed it because Jesus is still God. And what does God do when he gets displeased or offended? He curses things. Again, you cannot separate Jesus from God. They are the same temperament. It is shown all over the New Testament. Like, even if you were trying to make this a metaphor, which there's not good reason to believe it was, especially when Jesus is so precise to say when he is speaking in parables, why not make the ending of this better? Why not just rebuke the tree? Why not correct the tree? Why not love the tree and then watch it bear fruit even out of season? Nope, curse it. Got it. And last, listening. It's so important to learn to listen, to attentively listen, to listen for the goal of truly understanding, etc. So I didn't narrow this down yet. I'd written down a few verses or so. I'll just read them all to you. Let's do Isaiah 1:15. When you spread out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Jeremiah 7:16. As for you, do not pray for this people or lift up a cry of prayer for them, and do not intercede with me, for I will not hear you. And I wrote down one more from Jeremiah 11:11 through 14. Therefore, thus says the Lord, behold, I am bringing disaster upon them that they cannot escape. Though they cry to me, I will not listen to them. Does God listen according to the Bible? Yes. Does he sometimes choose not to? Absolutely. This is in direct contrast with everything else that God says about prayer, about always listening, about asking and receiving, about intercession making a difference. Nope, not if God doesn't will it. That's the only true thing God ever said about prayer. Make sure you're praying for what my will is. I guess that's one way to make sure your prayers get answered, but that also makes prayer immediately meaningless. But this isn't an episode on prayer. Check that out here, though. This was to say, God's a bad listener. He only listens on his conditions when it suits him. Try telling that to your therapist at your next couples counseling. It will not go well. So that's it. Those were my 20 mental health concepts and how God fails. God needs to go to therapy. Thank you for watching. Let me know any that you would add. Again, I understand some of this was being a bit silly or snarky. I try usually not to be too sarcastic or add too much humor because I want to keep a serious tone when so many people are really struggling with the nature of this religion and trying to figure out the mess of inconsistencies that this Bible holds for us about who this God is and what our relationship with him should be like. But I do think we still covered enough things here where if you're doubting, deconverting, or deconstructing, I hope this could be of some benefit to you. So thank you for watching. I do believe the plan will be for a week from now, next Sunday, to flip the script and look at all the advice God gives, not what he says about himself, but what he tells us to do, and put that up against what we have of these 20 concepts in mental health. Other than that, here's all the videos that I did this week. Please check those out if you have not. And until next time, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, GVI, Jacob, Jason, Joe, Oliver, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod, Karolina, and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Anne, Elijah, Rokkit, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel, or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine patrons. Thanks, and have a great day.